They didn't collapse in a single moment. They faded, quietly. A soldier leaves his post on the edge of the world, and with him, something invisible disappears. Not just protection, not just power, order. For nearly 4 centuries, Rome had shaped Britain into something structured, predictable, almost permanent. Roads stretched across the land like veins. Coins moved through hands with quiet authority. Laws existed not as ideas, but as force. And then, almost without ceremony, that force withdrew. No final battle. No dramatic ending. Just absence. And what replaces order when it vanishes is rarely immediate chaos. It's something slower. Something more unsettling. Uncertainty. By the year 410 AD, Britain wasn't simply abandoned. It was released. But release, in human terms, doesn't mean freedom. It means exposure. For generations, the people of this island had lived within a system larger than themselves. Decisions came from afar. Protection was guaranteed by an empire that believed itself eternal. And that belief mattered, because humans don't just rely on power. They rely on the illusion of permanence. Rome gave them that illusion, until it didn't. The truth is, Rome didn't leave Britain because it wanted to. It left because it had no choice. Across the empire, pressure was building, not from one enemy, but from many. Movements of people, shifting alliances, borders that no longer held, and beneath it all, exhaustion. Empires rarely fall from a single blow. They erode. Financial strain, military overstretch, internal conflict. Each piece alone manageable. Together, irreversible. Britain, distant and costly, became a calculation, and eventually a sacrifice. But what happens to a society when the system it depends on quietly disappears? Not collapses, disappears. At first, nothing obvious. The buildings still stand. The roads remain. The towns look familiar. But something beneath them begins to weaken. Coins stop arriving. Trade slows. Authority fades. And without authority, systems don't break instantly. They unravel. This is where most people misunderstand history. They imagine catastrophe as sudden. But real collapse is psychological. Before it is physical. It begins when people stop believing the system will hold. Because once that belief is gone, behavior changes. Local leaders stop waiting for instructions. Communities begin to rely only on themselves. Trust narrows. Survival becomes local. And slowly, the idea of a larger world fades. Britain didn't fall into darkness. It shrank. Cities that once connected to a vast empire became isolated pockets. Londinium, once alive with movement, quieted into something smaller, almost hesitant, not abandoned, but reduced. Grand buildings no longer served their purpose. Without the system that maintained them, they became empty shells. Impressive, but irrelevant. And humans don't preserve what no longer serves them. They adapt. Power, too, changed its shape. Without Roman governors, without centralized law, authority didn't vanish. It fragmented. Men who once operated within a system now became the system. Local warlords, former officials, landowners, not chosen, not elected, but necessary. Because when structure disappears, people don't stop seeking order. They accept whatever version of it remains, even if it's imperfect, even if it's unstable. But this wasn't the worst part, because internal collapse creates something else. Opportunity. And opportunity doesn't remain empty for long. For decades, Britain had faced raids from beyond its borders. Small attacks. Manageable threats. But those threats had always been held back by something larger. Now that barrier was gone, and the outsiders noticed. What begins as pressure becomes movement. What begins as movement becomes settlement. And what begins as settlement becomes transformation. The arrival of the Anglo-Saxons wasn't a single invasion. It was something more complex, more human. They didn't just come to conquer. They came to stay. At first, they were invited. A decision born from fear. Local leaders, struggling to defend their lands, turned to outsiders for help. Mercenaries, warriors, protectors. It made sense in the short term. But human history has a pattern. When you invite strength into a position of weakness, you rarely control what happens next. Those who arrive as protectors can become rulers, not immediately, but gradually. And once they establish themselves, the balance shifts. What was once assistance becomes dominance. The land begins to change, not overnight, but steadily. Languages shift, customs evolve, old identities blur. Because cultural transformation doesn't require destruction. It requires replacement. People adapt. They always do. Some resist. Some flee, but many adjust. Because survival often demands it. And over time, something subtle happens. The old world doesn't vanish. It dissolves into the new one. This is where the real transformation begins. Not in battles, not in conquests, but in identity. Latin fades from daily life. New words take its place, not imposed, but adopted. Because language follows power, and power had changed hands. Beliefs shift too. Old gods return, new gods arrive. Christianity, once growing under Roman influence, retreats, only to return again later, reshaped. Because religion, like identity, doesn't move in straight lines. It adapts to power, to culture, to survival. But beneath all of this, something deeper was happening, something less visible. The people of Britain were no longer Roman, but they weren't entirely something else yet. They existed in between, and that space is uncomfortable because humans prefer clarity, defined identity, a sense of belonging. But transformation denies that. It forces ambiguity, and ambiguity creates tension. This tension builds over generations until eventually something stabilizes. New kingdoms form, not because people choose unity, but because power consolidates. Small territories become larger ones. Leaders become kings. And slowly, structure returns. Different, but familiar in purpose. Because no matter how much societies change, they always rebuild hierarchy. They always recreate order, even after collapse. But here's the deeper truth, the one that history doesn't always state directly. Rome didn't just leave Britain physically. It left psychologically. For centuries, people had defined themselves within something larger. An empire, a system, a world that felt permanent. When that disappeared, they had to redefine themselves from the ground up. And that process is not clean. It's not efficient. It's not peaceful. It's human. By the time England begins to emerge centuries later, it isn't a continuation of Rome. And it isn't a complete replacement either. It's something blended, something shaped by loss, adaptation, and survival. This is why the story matters. Not because of Rome, but because of what happens after Rome. Because every society believes, at some level, that its structure will last, that its systems are stable, that its order is secure, until it isn't. And when that moment comes, the real question isn't whether collapse happens. It's how people respond to it. Do they cling to what's gone? Do they resist what's coming? Or do they adapt and become something new? Britain didn't fall when Rome left. It transformed, slowly, unevenly, uncomfortably. And from that transformation, a new identity was born. not planned, not controlled, but inevitable. Because history doesn't end when systems collapse. It begins again,
and then again.
in quieter ways.